Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gu Kim. In the first Leaders Summit of the Quad, U.S. President Joe Biden said Quad is going to be a vital arena for the Indo-Pacific region, adding that the U.S. will commit to ensure the region is governed by the international law, uphold universal values, and is free from coercion. Next week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin will travel together to Japan and South Korea, the first overseas trip for senior cabinet officials. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Jean Lee, Director of the Korea Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Ms. Lee was the first Pyongyang Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He is Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder has authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with the latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Young-Gu.
Great to be here. Thank you.
First of all, U.S. President Joe Biden met leaders of Australia, India, and Japan virtually in the first Quad summit. He said a free and open Indo-Pacific region was essential to all of their futures. What is the significance of this summit, Ms. Lee?
So I think this establishes the importance that this type of Quad discussion mechanism is going to have in the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. So seeing that they're bringing together these allies across the broader Indo-Pacific so early in the administration sends a very strong signal, I think, on what their strategy will be toward China. It's about bringing those allies together or trying to forge relationships with those allies to counter the rise of China. So I think this is a very important sign to what their priorities are going to be in the broader Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder?
Well, I agree with Jean. The administration is clearly trying to send a message about the importance of a rules-based order and also the common purpose of the states involved to deter coercive actions. And I think that the Biden administration has spent a lot of time thinking about the rollout of the strategy, because we have the Quad summit, and then we have this 2+2 trip. And then following that, we'll see the first engagement by the administration with officials from the People's Republic of China.
Mm-hmm. We'll discuss about the 2+2 a little bit later, but do you think there's any role South Korea can play in this regard, in this Quad regional forum? Mr. Snyder.
Well, the key to understanding the Quad is that it is part of a coalition building strategy involving cooperation among like-minded countries. And so I think the way to ask that question is, does South Korea consider itself to be a like-minded country? And if so, then yes, there's going to be an expectation that South Korea will participate actively as part of activities connected with the Quad or Quad Plus, or, I mean, honestly, the terminology, I think, should still be in flux, but it's really about building a coalition in response to concerns about Chinese coercion.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Lee, what's your thought on this?
Well, I think it remains to be seen whether South Korea will be invited to join, but there's certainly been some discussion in Seoul about whether it is the right time to join. I think there were hesitations on the South Korean side because they saw it as having to previously, under the Trump administration, having to choose between the United States and China, which is something that is very difficult for a country that is a neighbor and so reliant on trade with China to do. But on the other hand, if they're going to be left out of what is this broader coalition, which may have some policymaking influence when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, I think they'll certainly want to consider their role and their place in those discussions. So I think we'll see a lot of discussion about and debate about whether it's time to really push for inclusion in the Quad.
Mm-hmm. And Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin are going on their first foreign trip together to Japan and South Korea. According to the State Department, choosing Japan and South Korea as the first destinations was to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to the allies. What are the top issues the U.S. needs to align itself with these two countries? Ms. Lee first.
By sending the defense secretary and the secretary of state to South Korea and Japan, President Biden is making it very clear that he's going to follow through on a strategy of restoring alliances, and that is going to be a major component of his foreign policy. And by making Asia the first destination for his envoys, that underlines a commitment to the region. But of course, as you mentioned, it has strategic implications as well. And I think we'll get a better sense of the strategy on Asia through this trip, and particularly the discussions around China and North Korea.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, what will be the priority for the two secretaries during this trip?
It's clear that this has been carefully thought out. So the first priority is really to affirm that framework with both of its closest allies in Northeast Asia. But then as we look at the agenda, I think the big issues are China and North Korea. And with regards to the U.S.-South Korea consultation, I think the big challenge is really the relative priority of China versus North Korea as part of the overall strategy. It's pretty clear that the U.S. is focused on countering China, but we know that the Moon administration is very focused on North Korea.
And this is the first time in 5 years for the U.S. to hold this so-called 2+2 meeting with their South Korean counterparts. And of course, North Korea is one of the most important issues between the two allies. During a testimony before the House lawmakers, Secretary Blinken said the U.S. needs to make sure it has the best possible tools to advance North Korea's denuclearization, and in particular, to look at the different pressure points. Ms. Lee, what do you think he meant by different pressure points?
So I do believe that if you look back again, what the top policymakers in the Biden administration have done in the past, and particularly with Iran and the nuclear deal with Iran, that will give some hint to the approach they may take on a deal with North Korea, even though the situations are different. And that is, in particular, use of sanctions as a diplomatic tool. And hopefully, if they do continue down that path, they will look at them and how they can use them as a diplomatic tool and use them effectively. And that would also mean using them as incentive, right? So I think that perhaps hint to the approach that they're intending to take, though, again, I would say the Korea policy review is still underway. Perhaps they're still working out the details of that strategy, and so we have to wait to see what that entails.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what's your view on this?
Well, the other Iran-related issue that has come up was Secretary Blinken's statement that he is not ready to see South Korea release cash transfers to Iran as related to the vessel that the Iranians have detained, the South Korean military vessel. And so that, I think, also signals a kind of harsh approach or a pressure-oriented approach, that pressure will continue to be an important part of the strategy. And of course, it also reflects the fact that we have a lot of mistrust with North Korea. And also, frankly, that the Biden administration, a lot of their team may feel that we've fallen behind on deterrence during the course of the past 4 years, where North Korea has actually continued to advance its program, both with small-scale testing and through other measures internally that have clearly led to improvements.
Just to follow up on that, do you think Biden team has decided whether to go a step-by-step approach or a big deal approach towards North Korea? Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think the question you're really asking there is, are we going to focus on the journey or are we going to focus on the destination? And I think that it probably is the case that having tried to focus on the destination with no fruitful results, it's more likely that the Biden administration is going to be focused on the journey. And there, I think that actually there's a kind of simpatico in terms of views or of what South Korea might desire. for the U.S. to pursue because it means that we're not just going to sit and wait. But of course, the big problem is that we are going to sit and wait for North Korea. North Korea hasn't given the green light to talks, and it's simply not clear that there is a formula that the U.S. can offer that would have a tangible impact on North Korea's thinking in terms of engagement on nuclear issues.
Ms. Lee, do you have any thought on this?
Well, I just want to say, I think Scott put it so poetically, and I agree that I think it would be more about the journey rather than what we saw with President Trump, which was really looking for these dramatic moments right up front, thinking about the short-term gain rather than the long-term sustainable process that something like this would entail. And I think we need to recognize that 2021, when it comes to North Korea's nuclear program, is very different than 2016. They've made significant advancements, so it's going to be a very different calculation. And I think what we're seeing is the policymakers in the Biden administration referring back to past agreements, but also having to make the adjustments for the reality of where that program is now. And as Scott notes, it may seem like North Korea is quiet, and in terms of provocations, perhaps yes, but that doesn't mean they're not continuing to maintain and perhaps even develop their program. And so that will have to be taken into consideration. The stakes are going to be much higher if and when we get back to the negotiating table.
And another issue is the U.S. made it clear that human rights will be central at the U.S. foreign policy. Meanwhile, former advisor to the South Korean president said U.S. should focus on the nuclear issue, not human rights when it comes to North Korea. Ms. Lee, what is your take on this?
Well, I think Professor Moon Jung-in knows that the North Koreans would just reject and rebuff any discussion about human rights. But I don't think that means that we let go. I think that it's very important to address human rights as well as part of a broader discussion about bringing North Korea into the international fold. And I would use Britain as an example of a country that has a two-track policy of engagement. So they do engage North Korea. They have an embassy. It's temporarily closed right now, but they do have an embassy. But they also push North Korea fairly aggressively on human rights. So it is possible. You can't really compare the relationships between the United States and the U.S. with its relationship with Britain, of course. But I think there are examples of ways that you can have a kind of principled diplomacy and engage without giving up on the principles that are so central to the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, we've talked about this issue before, but how seriously do you see the gap between the U.S. and South Korea about the human rights issue?
Well, it's problematic, but I think it's manageable. And I actually want to develop Jean's point, though, with regards to the UK approach to addressing human rights in North Korea. And there may be differences of opinion on this, but the really interesting question that I watched very closely in the early 2000s was the question of whether having a relationship would enable a deeper conversation on human rights, because clearly in the U.S. case, there's not a relationship, and that could be regarded as an impediment to a conversation on human rights. But when we look at what the British have actually been able to accomplish through their diplomatic relationship, I actually don't see that much of a difference, to be honest. And I think that what that tells us is that ultimately the driver for change in North Korea is going to have to come from within. But the driver for change in South Korea on the human rights issue also has to come from within. And so what I'm watching is how the domestic public opinion in South Korea evolves with regard to the Moon administration's position at the UN on North Korea's human rights.
The U.S. continues to emphasize the cooperation among the U.S., South Korea, and Japan in dealing with North Korean issues. And during the Trump administration, North Korea has kept a moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile tests, but it continued on testing its short-range missiles, posing a threat to Japan's security. Do you think the Biden administration will share Japan's concerns?
Yeah, I do think they're going to share Japan's concern about it, but the really interesting early test is going to be what they actually do if North Korea conducts a short-range missile test. And the good news is that North Korea really has refrained from conducting those kinds of tests since March of last year. And that's quite notable. It seems that there must have been some factor, maybe COVID or something else, that really curtailed their testing efforts. But I do think that the Biden administration will be under pressure to take this issue to the UN if North Korea resumes low-level testing. South Korea will not like that. Japan will be more satisfied with it. And frankly, the UN as a venue for responding to those issues also is much more complicated today than I think that it was in 2017.
Ms. Lee, what kind of role does the U.S. expect Japan to play on the North Korean front?
At the very beginning, I think we will see the Biden administration pushing for South Korea and Japan to identify their common interests when it comes to North Korea and to keep that in mind as they restore some of the elements of their relationship, both diplomatic and in terms of military relationship, that have floundered or have deteriorated over the last few years as they've both gone into kind of a nationalistic mode, more of a nationalistic mode. So, we saw some of that communication deteriorate, and I think at the very least, the Biden administration will want to get them back on the same page with the common interest when it comes to North Korea, and not to let their bilateral relationship or bilateral differences get in the way of a broader strategy in Northeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, the conflict between South Korea and Japan goes deep. And to what degree does the U.S. want the two countries to patch up their relationship, do you think?
So I would just say that, every countries have their own bilateral issues and their own difficult histories, and that's certainly the case for South Korea and Japan. And so I do think that the U.S. has to recognize that. But then also, this is an opportunity for the Biden administration to reassert itself as a kind of coalescing role, in a leadership role in the region, and just remind them that they have some shared interests, but recognizing that they also have their national interests and that these can sometimes butt up against a broader vision that the United States might have. But I would argue that once they identify that they share a common interest in peace and security in the Northeast Asia region, that they'll be able to find some common areas of agreement.
In what area does the U.S. want the two countries to collaborate specifically?
Well, it's primarily on security and on policy toward North Korea. And so that is actually what the value of a mechanism of trilateral engagement provides, is an opportunity to create a framework that insulates cooperation on those issues from other sticking points in the relationship. So I think that if the U.S. can drive or organize cooperation, including Japan and South Korea, on those issues and help to keep it away from some of the more intractable issues related to history, then the Biden administration will be satisfied with its ability to achieve its objectives and also with allied responses.
So, Mr. Snyder, do you think much emphasis will be put on the trilateral engagement during this trip?
It's a strong sub-message, but I think that we have to ask the question of to what end. And clearly the theme of our conversation has been China. Ironically, China actually, I think, will remain a bit of a sticking point as related to being a focus of trilateral cooperation among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. So better in that framework to really direct the focus on North Korea.
And Ms. Lee, your final thoughts?
Underlining of the commitment toward Asia, but I think that we have to put that in the broader perspective of how this is part of a strategy on China. But I think that for the Biden administration, getting all of the partners on board, and then we need to mention that there is a meeting with Chinese officials scheduled in Alaska right after these visits to Tokyo and Seoul. So it's not just about touching base and coming up with strategy with the allies on China, but also engaging with China. And so perhaps in a longer view, finding that way to to work with China. And I do think that that is part of the strategy that will work with North Korea. And so this trip is going to be huge. It's going to be very interesting. I think we're going to learn a lot. But I think it should be reassuring for everyone in the region that even though we don't have a Korea policy out there yet, that there's a clear plan and a clear strategy for the region.
Meanwhile, General Robert Abrams, the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, said North Korea continues to pose a serious threat to the United States and ally South Korea as Pyongyang pursues a nuclear arsenal and other weapons of mass destruction. But the allies have continued to scale back their joint military exercises over the past few years. Whether this has created room for diplomacy towards the denuclearization of North Korea remains to be seen. Ms. Lee and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.